Mr. President, let me start today by commending the remarks by the junior senator from South Carolina. Throughout this week, in several, I guess it's now 3 times this week, his words and his passion have both inspired us and informed us, but I think he's also challenged all of us to do more for our country. So I'm grateful that I was here for his remarks today, and I commend him for those words and for what he talked about on the floor today. Mr. President, let me ask first consent that Stephen Dietz, a Senate fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges for the duration of my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. 3 months ago, I spoke on the floor to highlight the need to expand our arsenal of financial measures against the terrorist group ISIS, which we know is also known as ISIL and known by other names or acronyms. I'll use the acronym ISIS. I said at that time that these agents of hate, violence, and chaos could be significantly diminished by attacks on their finances. Not long after that, the President signed into law the bipartisan Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act, which I sponsored here in the Senate, which will undermine ISIS's ability and efforts to pillage antiquities in Iraq and Syria for profit. But we need to keep up the pressure on this issue on ISIS. All terrorist organizations, of course, need resources to survive, and this is a vulnerability we must fully exploit. Dismantling the financial networks that support terrorism is a critical part of our mission to protect the United States of America. ISIS is the best example of how pressing the need is today. Militarily, ISIS continues to destabilize Iraq and Syria at the expense of millions of civilians who are caught in the crossfire. It continues to cultivate affiliates in Northern and Western Africa, Central Asia, and other parts of the Middle East. It continues to sow the seeds of terror in neighboring countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and further afield in Europe, Africa, and of course here in the United States. Thousands, many thousands of innocent lives have been tragically and unjustly lost in these attacks. Financially, ISIS relies on a variety of revenue streams, and we must attack all of them. U.S. and coalition air power is disabling oil refineries and stopping smuggling convoys in their tracks. U.S. Air Force Major General Peter Gersten, Deputy Commander of the Combined Joint Air Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, reported on April 26th of this year, quote, ISIS's ability to finance their war through oil refineries has been destroyed, unquote. That's good news, but we have a lot more to do. As a result, ISIS is cutting its fighters' salaries. It's plundering anything and everything it can reach. It's looting banks, kidnapping for ransom, extorting money directly from the 8 million people caught in its territory. According to the Center for Analysis of Terrorism, such extortion now accounts for more than 1/3 of the income of ISIS. Tough sanctions have helped curtail ISIS's ability to access the international banking system, but ISIS is using informal channels to receive and spend money off the grid. Non-monetary transfer systems and informal exchange houses operating across multiple countries have been less vulnerable to traditional sanctions. As ISIS adapts, so must the United States. The Department of the Treasury has been relentless in identifying and blacklisting individuals and entities that finance terror. I applaud them for this work. And yet, because terrorist groups exploit financial jurisdictions to channel their ill-gotten gains, the United States cannot effectively stop terrorist financiers by itself. our coalition partners must join this fight. We cannot afford weak links in this chain. In February of this year, I visited Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar to conduct oversight of our terrorism finance strategy. I found that the events of the last 2 years have brought this issue of terrorism financing into sharper focus for the countries in the region. While many of our coalition partners are taking steps in the right direction, much more work needs to be done to stem this tide. We need to see more investigations turn into arrests, more prosecutions, and more sentencing that takes terrorist financiers off the streets. As with nuclear non-proliferation, we need to build and reinforce the international architecture that governs international cooperation to stop terrorist financiers. Last week, Senator Isakson and I introduced the STORM Act, S-T-O-R-M, the Stop Terrorist Operational Resources and Money Act. This act authorizes a new designation called, quote, jurisdiction of terrorism financing concern if a country is not doing enough to stop terrorist financiers. Once designated by the United States of America, in fact, once designated by the President of the United States of America, that country would face significant penalties that include the cessation of aid and the suspension of arms sales. To avoid the penalties, the country can also enter into a technical assistance agreement with the United States to remediate the problems that led to its designation. The STORM Act also sanctions foreign financial institutions that make deals on behalf of ISIS or launder money for ISIS. Like this chamber's recent action to sanction foreign banks that deal with Hezbollah, we must ensure that no part of the international banking system is left open to ISIS. We expect overseas banks to join with us by using all of its tools at its disposal to make certain that they are not unwittingly or negligently acting for ISIS. Banks that fail to do so have no right to do business with the United States of America. So the STORM Act will be a powerful tool in the President's arsenal and future President's arsenal to starve terrorist groups of the resources they need to survive. I'd like to thank Senator Isakson for his original co-sponsorship of this important legislation. It is essential that we send it through the Foreign Relations Committee, through the Congress, both House and Senate, and to the President's desk for signature as soon as possible. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.